Welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. Whether you're an athlete trying to perform at your best when it counts the most, a coach or business leader trying to get more out of your team, or someone looking for more personal growth, this is the place for you. This podcast is your map to guide you to the right mindset, systems, and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. And now, here's John Cullen and Brandon Allen.
All right, welcome into the show. Brandon, how are you doing?
I'm good. How about you?
Fine, thanks. I'm going to start the shows out like that from now on because
okay. I'll be a little more prepared.
I've been realizing that I just get I get so excited about like what the conversation is that we're getting ready to get into that I sometimes forget to just pause for a minute. Hey, how's Brandon doing? Let's do a check-in.
First of all, and to break down the fourth wall, I mean, we have already been talking to each other for close to an hour at this point, or 2 hours.
Yes.
So you have a pretty good sense of where I'm at, as do I with you. So, it's okay. And I don't think the listeners care one way or the other.
I think you'd be shocked about that. I think if we had a survey right now, I think that they would be on my side on the fact that they really do care how you're doing. Even though I've already talked to you for over an hour and probably sometime before that. So,
right.
But listen, enough about us. We have an amazing guest tonight.
Oh boy, do we.
I mean, talk about one that chills. You get just hearing this story. So Dr. Mary Ritz is the owner and founder of Almenta International. Which is, talk about leadership. They do all kinds of different programs there. There's a mastermind program. They have a program called The Plunge, which is geared for, it's really a leadership program. And she talks about that in the show. She came on our radar from Brian Davidson, who the folks might remember from a couple of podcasts ago, who's the, MindView founder. And speaking of MindView, exciting announcement coming about them because we are going to have an opportunity to offer a discount promo code, if you will, through not even if you will, it's what it is.
It is what it is.
I don't know why I said, I don't know why I said if you will. If you will.
Like when I'm done doing this, I'm going to go eat dinner, if you will, because it's not breakfast time. It is exactly dinner.
So if you will, we have a promo code for MindView that will be coming up. We will have it on next week's show to be able to share with you guys. So any of you who are interested in taking that mindset assessment that they offer through MindView, it's the profile. You will have a promo code that you can get through the Mental Advantage podcast starting next week.
If you will.
Now, if you will. Now, back to the star of the show, Dr. Mary Ritz. Guys, as I mentioned, founder of Almenta International. She's the author of a book called Customer Centricity, which was her focus in education. She has her PhD in business administration with a focus on customer centricity and a million other degrees. She's a certified John Maxwell trainer, speaker, and coach. Wow. She's originally from Zimbabwe. And I think this is the part of the story that is so remarkable because when Brandon and I start this conversation with her, you start to hear some of the formative years, what was going on in the formative years for her and the challenges she was facing and the inspiration, motivation, direction, all of those good things that her family and parents kind of helped her along that journey. And it's remarkable, Brandon. I mean, it's one of those that I think if the listeners really will have to kind of take not just even listening to it a couple of times, but just really, truly, when you're listening to this, let it sink in, that foundation piece, that like early start, because I think it just makes the rest of the story even more remarkable.
Well, it is a remarkable story. She is a remarkable woman. And I think, John, that you bring up a good point in terms of I think you could listen to the story, because the way she tells it and the way that it builds and it provides, she talks and mentions it several times about context and contextualizing certain pieces. I think that as you go through it and you hear it, you almost want to go back and go, now that I know this makes this even more remarkable. Right. And, I don't think she would, I don't think she would disagree. It's not just remarkable. It is, providential. I mean, she was put in a spot, her father, her grandmother, her family. It is an amazing interview. And I hope that the listeners get as much out of it as I did. I found myself to get emotional during the interview, and I don't know. I think it's a wonderful story.
And what's striking is the humility in which she's telling the story. Sure. I mean, it's like, the humility, the grace. I mean, it's amazing story. Definitely, and I think you bring up a really good point there, is that there are so many different look back moments that you're like, oh, wow, that's even more remarkable because of, in spite of, I found myself thinking a lot of it's all, and we talk about this all the time, guys, on this show, is that, you're going to be dealt different hands in life. And sometimes it's weekly, sometimes it's daily, sometimes it's monthly, whatever the case may be. And, going all the way back to Nina Sossaman Pogue, when she talked about, the little this and the big this, like there's things that happen, and it's how you respond to that. That's kind of the foundation of this whole podcast that we started from day one, was that event plus response equals outcomes. Is you're going to hear from Dr. Mary Ritz a lot of really unbelievable events, but I really want you to dial into the response. And I really want you to, because none of the outcomes that she has are going to be, are possible without her being able to respond the way she did. And it's all about just move forward. It's all about just keep on going. And I think it's just such a remarkable story. Before we get into that interview, though, I do want to point out that we have next week's show, Bob Caslen and Mike Matthews, who are the co-authors of The Character Edge, Leading and Winning with Integrity. And if you remember, we talked a little bit about, this topic on the show with Brian Davidson from Mindview, about this ethics fading. And this is something that this is going to be a really fascinating conversation with these two. I mean, I'm holding in my hand the Character Edge book, and it's a bestseller. I mean, easily bestseller. It's one of the hottest books. And these are two gentlemen who are known throughout, in being, very highly regarded with their opinions and thoughts on character and integrity and all those good things. So, in the meantime, get your pen and paper ready, though, because here is Dr. Mary Ritz. Well, Dr. Mary Ritz, welcome to the show. We're so fortunate to have you with us this evening. Thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Brandon. What a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Absolutely. One of the many skills, as the listeners heard there in the introduction about Almenta International, one of the many skills that you guys help develop with your clients is resilience. And that one stood out to me particularly, mainly because of your background. And what I mean by that is you are from Zimbabwe, a country in Southern Africa. And I really don't think we can even get too far into this interview without hearing a little bit more about what that was like, because I know there were some challenges, and probably an understatement to say some challenges for you growing up. But could you just share with us and the listeners a little bit about what it was like growing up as a child in Zimbabwe, some of the challenges that you all were facing, both personally and as a family?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. It is a story, though I do a whole lot of other work, John. It's a story of resilience. For me to even be sitting here with you, gentlemen, it is a story of resilience. So the first thing I'd like to just qualify is that there are two sides to Zimbabwe. There's the privileged side, and there's the less privileged side. The privileged side of Zimbabwe is pretty cool. You would not want to leave Zimbabwe at all, or parts of Africa. You're born there, you're raised there. If you want to go to the first world, it's out of choice because your life is really set.
Wow.
For me, though, it was not like that. I came from the less privileged side of Zimbabwe. So not going far ahead of myself. So with that understanding that you're growing up with less privileges, but you have these parents that believe so much in education, that believe so much that there are no limitations for you whatsoever. You had no choice but to have that kind of mindset and approach life as such. So whatever barriers you had, you just had to, I call it flexing it. Mm-hmm. What else can come out of this?
Right.
And when I was growing up in Zimbabwe, we had just gained our independence. That's when I was alert. Mm-hmm. So around the atmosphere was a hope for the Black people who had just gained independence from the colonizers. Mm-hmm. So my dad at that point was moving into managerial. Before that, there was another story that maybe we can get into later. So there was just a sound of hope, a sound of go and get educated so that you can catch up with what you did not have in terms of a better house, in terms of even managing vacation. So in that, education was highly, highly encouraged to always be better in terms of just improving your lifestyle. Hard work was really a part of it. So even today, I'm not sure how aware you are about the social context of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's economy is not functional right now. That's a country in my observation and in my experience that should be at a halt. But because the people are so resilient and are hard workers, it keeps going. Right. You wonder why, because the fabric of Zimbabweans is hard work. So that's where I'm coming from. I also like just to talk about social context, very collective, family oriented. So I'll share a story. I think one of the questions that I'm normally asked is that how come Zimbabweans or Africans don't really adopt? There are so many kids to adopt.
Right.
We say, no, we don't officially adopt, but our nephews and our nieces are our children and we send them to school. Yeah. So it's a very collective. So that's the sort of environment that I looked at, and I'm looking at it at a national level. But I also want to highlight their influences, right? We are now exposed to the American way of doing, the individualistic way of doing. So some of that, you can see it today, that is permeating some cultures in Zimbabwe. So yes, the collective is still there, but there's a lot of individualistic. So just to tie this down, when I was growing up, it was about work, values, respect for the elderly, family, hard work, because you want to come out of the less privileged places.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned that idea of some of that fabric that was sown in you at an early age, and your parents, I know, were so instrumental in this. Your dad specifically, in his focus on education, I know was such a foundation for not just yourself, but your 6 brothers and sisters. You come from a large family of 7, just like I do. I think you're the 5th. You had said I'm the 2nd to the youngest, so I'm the 6th in that group. But your dad really fascinates me, Dr. Mary, because of he is somebody who came from literally lived in a mud hut. I love the story I heard you tell about, he realized early on that education was so paramount because his mother had sold a goat just so that he could get, an education. Could you talk a little bit about that story? Because I think it really underscores, if you will, where that, kind of, fascination or real, focus on education came from.
Sure. The story is rich, if I can say that, as his daughter. Every day, I'm biased, obviously. I wonder every day, like, how did this all happen? Because it doesn't make sense.
Right.
And I think in that same podcast that you listened to, I was saying that even my cousins who are still there, it's North America, it's North and South. The worlds are so different apart. So my dad, so there are different parts of Zimbabwe. There's the less disadvantaged, then there's the less disadvantaged.
Wow.
That's where my dad came from. Where our dialect, because you can speak the same language, but if the dialects can be different. Our dialect, where my dad came from, the rest of Zimbabwe could not really understand. They were looked down upon. Nothing good was supposed to come out of there. And then my dad comes out. And what's also very fascinating is that the person who charters his course for education is a woman who does not even know how to speak English, who doesn't write. So you wonder why my grandmom decides to send my dad to school and to sell this goat. In this particular, what I would say, if I can use this language loosely, please, gentlemen, if you can allow me to do that, like God-forsaken country. That's where it was. Nobody would remember that part of the world. And then here's a woman who's been marginalized herself, and she decides to sell a goat and say, you are going to go to school, and sends her second child, her first son, away. By the way, he could have stayed in the rural areas to look after the farm, he was supposed to take over the homestead of my grandmother.
Right.
But my grandmother says, no, he is going away to school.
Wow.
And when he goes away to school, gentlemen, he does not have proper clothes. It's just something to cover himself. And then the school he goes to is not a privileged school. It's where he has to go and work in the fields, in the tea estate first to pay for the rest of his education. Wow. And then go to school in the afternoon. So he has done hard labor before he goes to school.
Wow.
So that's the kind of fabric that I come from. And I honor him, and even my grandmother. And then from there, he just starts to move forward. Though he never goes back physically to the rural areas, but he supports, he becomes the breadwinner for his parents. And then he goes into South Africa, works in the mines. And I always tell a story that when he gets there, he was supposed to go under the mines. Then he negotiates. He says, but I'm a bit educated, man.
Right.
I have 7th grade education. I can write, I can read. I'm sure I can be the clerk. Yes. There's negotiation power, right? Not letting your circumstances. He already thought he was highly qualified. And guess what? That's what he became. He became the clerk, and he used to, do the lighter job, so to speak, because he thought he was educated enough. Yeah.
And it's my favorite part of that story is that self-advocacy that he demonstrates, that he advocates for himself and says, look, granted, it might only be to a 7th grade level, but I can read, I can write, I can do all of the things that you would need. And then what's so special about him in this story is that he then later comes back and starts to give back to those that are like him.
Mm-hmm.
He, almost a mentorship, if you will, but he's helping others. And it's something, Dr. Mary, that I think is so, and we're going to get into this a little bit more because I'm so fascinated with this idea of people who come from very little and have lots of challenges, that once they make it, they never forget others. They're always reaching back. They're always putting their hand back down saying, hey, let me help you come back up. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of examples of that. There's one of the things, though, I think that is important is you mentioned about females having very little opportunities at that time in Zimbabwe. And we're being marginalized. Your dad recognized early on that education was key. He had seen it firsthand in himself. He immediately began putting a focus on this when he has a family with you, your sisters especially. This really becomes your currency, right? This becomes the thing that, like, hey, all of you and your sisters have postgraduate degrees. It was a big thing for each one of you. So why do you think that is that people who have been through some of the challenges like your dad, that they're always so quick to reach back and pull others up?
Because they understand. That's number one. Mm-hmm. They've been there. They mm-hmm. know what it is like not to have and to look for an opportunity. They were looking for the opportunity. Most of it, they were looking for support. They couldn't. They formulated their own trajectory. So why not go there? They've got empathy. They've been there. They've walked it. They go there. But there's also something. I think there's a heart. Mm-hmm. Because we also know that there are some people that were there. I'm talking about my own country right now, that we were colonized, but we are in power now. And some of our leaders are marginalizing some of us. So you can't always say because you've been there, then you can go back and empathize on others and lift others up. So I think there's that second element of actually having a heart and a passion for people, and really serving them, a true love, a genuine love for people. I'll give you an example. As my dad was beginning to drive cars, buying cars, we would be riding with my dad and would see people on the road, and he would literally stop his little truck and say, let's just carry these people, man. They've got all these sacks and all this. They need help. They need food. So it was just part of who he was. So it's the heart as well, in addition to the empathy.
So Dr. Mary, the other thing that I think, and you mentioned it early about where Zimbabwe, the fabric there. I think that hope probably plays a really big role in that too, right? I mean, having that hope, knowing that at least there's now this opportunity. And I think as you go back and try to reciprocate as you continue to work as your father continues to work towards, whatever his goals were at the time, mm-hmm. that little bit of hope that he is spreading, and that everybody can see, okay, he did this from what you described as impoverished as you can be. Mm-hmm. He did this, and that is such a powerful thing for everybody. That's amazing. It's a really amazing story.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, Brandon. Dr. Mary was so fascinated by education and teaching when she was younger, and having that. And I think you hit it right on the head, is that you need, when you're in those situations, you need to at least be able to visualize somebody doing mm-hmm. it, right? Mm-hmm. You need to have some thought that this can be done. And so I think for you and your siblings, it was so important to see that your dad had achieved these great things. And we kind of cut off the end of that story, but he not only does he start out clerking, but then also just keeps working his way up. He just keeps on with that persistence. And when he retires in a managerial role, which is amazing to me to think that, knowing where he started from, and then the fact that he was able to climb that ladder, so to speak. But this has such a great impact on you and your life that at 9 years old, you would come home from school, and where I'm going with this. You would teach your imaginary classes, and so much so that your siblings called you the teacher, which I thought was really funny because I could picture my siblings doing something very similar to that. Yeah. But I want to go back to this point about currency, because I think this is so important. Is that everybody, we talk on this show all the time about finding whatever that thing is for you and yourself. But, having that personal currency is so important. Is you think about some of the athletes right now in our society that live in some really bad areas. They are in bad neighborhoods, urban areas, whatever the case may be. And their currency becomes athleticism. Your currency became education. But the common thread there is that neither one really has a plan B, right? Like if you don't grasp onto education, and if those athletes aren't grasping onto whatever, they'll grasp onto whatever that thing is that's going to pull you out of that current situation. But again, just like you had mentioned earlier, it's that desire to pull people back. I wanted to share with you a story. Brandon's heard me tell this story, but years ago, I had the privilege of meeting and kind of preparing for this podcast made me think back to this story. I had the privilege of meeting a young man who was from Rwanda. His family actually escaped the genocide in 1994. They left there when 800,000 people were slaughtered during the 100 days of bloodletting in Rwanda. I met him in a hotel lobby, and we just started a conversation. He starts telling me about his story, which I was fascinated with. But what was really interesting to me is he's 8 years old, and they're escaping. I mean, in this journey we spent 2 hours talking, and he's telling me about the close calls they had with death and all of the things that he saw it as an 8-year-old. I can't even imagine. No 80-year-old should see these things, but as an 8-year-old, he was exposed to so many shocking things. But one of the things that struck me, and your story reminds me of this, is I remember asking him at the end of the conversation, so what's your American dream? Now your family is, you're here, you kind of have not left that stuff behind, because I don't think you can ever leave that behind, but what's your American dream? What do you hope to accomplish here? And he didn't hesitate, and he looked at me and he said, I just want to be a part of helping people unlock their full potential. And I was just like, wow. Like, I think so often we see people have that string of bad luck, that what we would consider bad luck in a first world country, right? And they allow that to kind of define them or dictate how the future is going to be. But it's so refreshing to see these stories, people like yourself, people like this young man that I had a chance to talk to, who have pulled themselves out. But then the first instinct is just, how can I give back? It's that servant leadership, we talk about all the time, is giving up of myself to help others.
Yes. You're speaking to exactly the belief. The belief is that there is hope. There is something inside of you. Whatever the circumstances are, I do not think it's an accident that you and I are here, or an 8-year-old in Rwanda was born. There is something that is in them. It's a question of, how do you tap into it? Can you tap into it? You talked about, how some, for me, it was education. For some here in America is sports, right? But for me, it's always like, what is the hanging fruit? What is it that you can do? What have you been given in your hands? And for some in Africa, is selling those tomatoes in the afternoon after school. And for some is making sadza or a meal and packaging it. What is it? And then you start from there. And then once you start from there, and not wanting to achieve the success immediately, but to stay with it. And that's where I love the people that come from less privilege, because they know how to stay with it. Even though it's not glamorous right now, it's chaotic initially, but they have a tendency of staying with it and being resilient with it because they know where they're coming from. And then when they're there, or where we are here, that heart of serving, again, not necessarily because you've walked the road, but because you're passionately in love with people. You passionately know what's going on in Zimbabwe, and you want to go and make a difference to that child who was like me 40 years ago, who is waiting for somebody to give them hope and to tell them that, yes, you can have a PhD. So it's genuinely care. And that's what I think leadership is about. Leadership, yes, we can make money. Don't get me wrong. Go ahead and make that money and stuff like that. But God, take that money and make a difference. And see people, meet them exactly where they are.
So, Doctor, I'm trying to formulate it because it really is about, you mentioned a fabric of a country where you're grinding, you understand what that grit and resiliency looks like. Do you remember lessons? Obviously, you've got this shining example in your father, but to have a country that has that resiliency, you mentioned it earlier about the economic status, but they just find a way. What is it, as we'd say here, like what's in the water to make everybody appreciate that journey, that grind, and not focus on that end goal?
Brandon, you're touching something now that I cannot even fathom myself, because as a Zimbabwean, when I go back, things have really gone backwards. And I don't know what keeps them going. Because even the level of my resilience, I want to be humble. And say, I have never seen that kind of resilience. These are people that just keep going, and they have a hope, and they have a joy, and they take pride in what they do and however they do it. There's just a sense that there's a hope. There's no more expectation to be rescued by the government at all. There was never, and now even more so. So it's almost like I need to make this happen for my family. I need to make this happen. So there's a self-belief that they can take themselves out. And I'll be fair and be honest. And I say, I'm curious to say, what are they drinking now that I did not even drink in? Because of the drive. I'd just like to believe it's hope. And also, Zimbabwe is predominantly a Christian nation. So even in that turmoil, there is no forsaking God or Jesus. Maybe other denomination as well. These are people that will work, and there's a faith. That's where they go to. So I'd like to believe there's a lot to do with that. Just that faith, just that trusting, a faith that's really blind, that does not focus on the circumstances, that just believes it's going to change.
It sounds like, too, both from faith and from, well, maybe it's a lot of faith, it sounds like there's a level of gratitude for whatever opportunity presents itself that day. And as impoverished as that is, I got to tell you, it sounds better than what I see today here in the United States, where there's very little gratitude. You speak of being humble, and it's very frustrating to watch. But the one thing that I'm hearing as you describe this is the level of gratitude for every opportunity given. That's really powerful.
Yeah. Brandon, even in my coaching, Brandon, I want to echo your words. Even in my coaching, sometimes I struggle when and I'm not looking down on anybody. I understand the economics are very different. It's first world, and the expectations could be higher. So when people are saying, my manager or my people are not acting in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And when I think in comparison to what I know other people that don't have, that they would kill, if I can use that language loosely, for this opportunity.
Yeah.
I kind of like, and that's where the international experience comes in. I've worked in 8 different countries. Mm-hmm. So it's me flexing that, okay, I'm working in a first world, so their perspective is very different. Mm-hmm. However, though it's very, very different, do they realize that somebody today may be going to school without breakfast? Yeah. Do they realize that somebody would do something to just get money to go to school? Mm-hmm. So, I know I cannot compare that, and I'm speaking with humility, and I want to be sensitive to the audience here. But yeah, before we criticize, before we demand, before we feel that we are entitled, can we look at what's going on around the world?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, that's my biggest ask. Yeah.
Well, and you hit on something there that I think is really important for the listeners to hear. And I've heard you talk a little bit about this in the past, that flexibility, that adaptability, that, being able to take whatever you're given that day and just, as your dad says, just move forward, right? Just make the next best decision. Just go and do whatever you can with it. And don't let that be the thing that stops you. I was recently speaking of some of the things going on in the country of Africa. I was recently I don't know if you saw the piece on ABC News about Sudan and just the unbelievably horrific situation that's going on over there with the wetlands and like the whole flooding, and there's no place for crops, and but yet, going back to what Brandon was talking about and you were talking about with that spirit of hope, is it's all about, okay, this is happening right now. What can we do that's going to, it's that, so what now, what we talk about, like, this is something that's happened now. What are we going to do about it? And I love the example that you shared, that I heard you share before about, when you turn that hot water on and it's not hot, what do? You can either sit there and complain about the fact that you don't have hot water, or you can put some water in a bucket or something and put it on the stove and make hot water, that I think is really at that foundational point of that. Is that something that I know you're, is not only important just from a personal performance standpoint, but it's also important from a leadership perspective as well.
It is. It's being flexible. It's not always going to be packaged in a perfect package. Mm-hmm. It's never going to be that way. If you live in a life like that's perfect, but it's rare that it's going to be packaged well. It's going to be written, Brandon, open in this way, open in this way. So if it's going to come in a different variation, it can be modified to suit whatever you need to, whatever you need to solve for. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's not getting 100%. Sometimes it's getting 80%, and being happy with it and knowing that you have moved from 50 to 80. You've moved from 10 to 100. It's not perfect, but it can work. And also realizing that factor that it's not perfectionism. It's about the process. Mm-hmm. It's about being creative. It's about understanding that there are nuances that come within a situation. Mm-hmm. And you got to adapt and you got to pivot and don't be too rigid. So I think what I hear a lot of Brandon and John is, and I know about this and I appreciate it, gentlemen, is who I am. I'm being my authentic self. I cannot do that.
Right.
As much as I love that language, don't get me wrong, I encourage it. But have you misunderstood it to the extent that it's now become a barrier to you because mm-hmm. you're no longer flexible?
Mm-hmm. Right.
You want things to come in a certain way. And if they don't come in that way, you deny them or do you decline them? I also want to caution, I'm not talking about your values and your beliefs. There's mm-hmm. a place for that where your heart is and you're not going to compromise on those values and those beliefs. I'm not talking about violating that, but I'm talking about things that you can tweak that can be challenged, new perspectives that you can gain so that you can move your business, you can move your team forward.
So one of the things that I hear, Doctor, when you talk about that is that we have to allow for grace for ourselves, right? Because otherwise you will not accept that 80%. You will not take anything other than perfection, and you eliminate that progress. So from a leadership perspective, that leader really needs to provide grace or allow for grace to happen, to be flexible, which I think then, as we've been talking about, goes back to that really strong fabric of faith. And, to your point, regardless of the religion or the denomination, is understanding that we have been given grace, and you can allow for grace not only to yourself but into your team. That becomes a really powerful thing, I think.
It is, Brandon. It is. Because a lot of leaders are walking into situations thinking they've got all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's because of the schooling, because of the experience that they've acquired, because of the ego, if I can go there too.
Mm-hmm.
All that is packaged, right? So when we are hired into these positions, yes, we are hired to solve problems. But as you can imagine, now we live in a VUCA world, very volatile, uncertain. Nobody really knows. We are all trying to figure it out. So as a leader, for me, it's about that humility and accepting that things are going to change. I will not have all the answers. That's where the faith comes in. That's where the grace comes in. The vulnerability comes in. And then actually saying to your team members, hey, I don't have the answers. I've hired you to co-create with me. I've hired you to help me take this ship and sail it forward. And as we're sailing it forward, we may fail, but let's give each other grace and understand that we are not perfect. Though we aspire for greatness, but in that, we are not always going to hit the mark. And if we fail to hit the mark that we so desire, what have we learned in the process in the meantime?
Yeah, it's so key. But it's also, having that ability to, like you all are saying, give that grace, but it's also recommitting, understanding that it's just a setback. It's just temporary. It's the power of yet, right? It's not happening yet. It doesn't mean it won't happen. It's just not happening yet. And then continuing to get back into that process. But then it's also, I think, that ability to help them envision it. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is the hope piece of it. But I think this is something that your family and your parents, again, to go back to your upbringing and how some of these things were formulated in your own experiences, is they help shape your destiny by your dad and mom, number one, would say to you all, you're going to be leaders. Mm-hmm. Everything was about what these things that you can aspire to be, and should be aspiring to be. And then also was being the best at whatever you're doing. Like, you talked about this idea that if, I love the fact that as a child of 7 in a family of 7, my parents were always bragging about the fact that every one of us was uniquely different. And I think that actually is a really good thing for parents and large families to do, because you're searching for your own identity in that large pack of people as it is. And so to have that affirmation from your parents that you are different, but yet the common thread that goes through your family, as went through mine, was, but if you're going to do something, strive to be the best at whatever that is. If you're going to be a teacher, try to be one of the best teachers. Yeah. If you're going to be an accountant like your sister, try to be one of the best. Like that, I think, is really the important role of not only parents to help shape that destiny, colleagues, if you think about your family, siblings as colleagues, but also as leaders, right, in organizations, to be able to challenge each other to always push forward.
Yes. It's we can even add to that. It's being able to extract that value in that person for them to be that. So we're bringing that environment in there to say, yes, you're so unique and you're talented, but then how do I help you bring out that best in you? How do I help Mary? So for me, my parents could see that I was the teacher. I was the one who liked to write things down, very organized. So my dad gave me projects around those things. I would write some of his documents, because he realized that was my inclination. My sister, who is the accountant, he knew that, this was what she was good at. And she was very good at cooking and, bringing people together. And it was her who ran our biggest feast altogether. She had that because they just simply understood that this child was gifted in this way and we were celebrated equally. Yeah.
I love that. It's interesting. And this is where I wanted to tie in your education into something. One of the things for the listeners, and we talked about this in the introduction, but you studied customer centricity. And I think it's a really fascinating thing for me to think about this from a leadership standpoint. Of course, you're talking about, this from a organizational standpoint, as far as keeping the customer first and really having that focus. But what you're talking about there from a parenting perspective and also from a leadership perspective is the same thing. We can apply that customer centricity kind of mindset to leadership, and we make it about the person. We pull out what are the things that are important to them? What are the things that they're passionate about? How can I feed their purpose so that they can now accomplish their goals, but yet together we're all going to be lifted higher, right? Have you found, as you're digging further into the leadership aspect of things, because I know that's a key ingredient to your company, that all of that background in customer centricity just really flows nicely into it, doesn't it?
It does. Because, John, the customer centricity business model touches on all those areas. It does not just touch on the customer there, but it touches on the quality of leadership. So there is a terminology that I use, customer centricity leadership, which is really obsessed about its customers and its people. So you cannot really be customer centric if you are not a customer centric leader. So it's bringing in those voices, just like you would bring in a voice of the customer, capturing those surveys or in different ways, different that voice of the customer is exactly about capturing the voice of the employee and making sure that that voice is influencing how you're running your organization. In the end, you are partnering so that you can solve for the customer. So your leadership style in that is about, so if you do that, it means that they're engaged, right? Your retention rate is higher because you're geared right that you understand that there is a parallel between the customer and the employee, so to speak. So yes, it speaks to leadership. All the things that John and Brandon, you guys talk about in terms of leadership and how you want to bring trust with your leader, with your team, all right? How you want to be vulnerable, humility, all those are a part of a customer-centric leader.
Yeah. So nice segue for both of us here into what I think is a really fascinating project that you all are working on with your company, The Plunge, the think tank for like-minded leaders. I don't know why I got twisted up on that. You'll find, Dr. Mary, it doesn't take a whole lot for me to get twisted up on words. But talk to us about The Plunge. I love that there's three parts to this. It's that leader mindset, the customer centricity we were just talking about, and then culture. What is that all about? What's The Plunge? What can people expect that sign up to participate?
Yes. So The Plunge is an initiative between Almenta International, which is my company, and a partnership with my colleague called Wayne Haustein, Learning Curve. He's also based here in Atlanta. we find that there's an opportunity to bring up leaders in those three primary areas. So it's a 6-month leadership program. And the three literally pillars of that are really leadership mindset, customer centricity, and then the culture. So in another model, we talk about the leader as in 4 levels of leadership. Number 1, leading self, leading the team, leading the organization, leading the community. So this is a short version of it, abbreviated version of it. What kind of a manager or leader are you in terms of your mindset internally? We believe that for you to be a great leader, the work starts off with you first. Your mindset, your perspectives, your emotional intelligence, the way that you make decisions. So you will see that it talks to that part first. As you are now acquiring those skill sets, the right mindset, then how can we help you develop your organization so that it becomes customer centric? So we compare that with another business model, which is product centricity. The whole essence is that we do not really portray ourselves or differentiate ourselves by our products, but we have this other model that can help us really build a sustainable business. So that is the second layer of the program. The last layer is that then how do we cultivate that culture? A culture that is positive, a culture that people want to come and rally. You talked about envisioning the strategy, portraying that future upward. How then do you bring a culture that makes it exciting to go to that future? How do we bring that? So those 3 components are very connected, intentionally starting with self first around leadership, then talking about the customer, and then how do we bring a culture that supports that?
It's funny. I was thinking when I was reading some about this, that and product centric, mindset and customer centric mindset is, I've always felt like there's a difference between a manager and a leader, right? And I think that if you had to kind of make that connection, a manager, I think it comes actually at things as more of that product centric mindset, because everything is about the tactics. It's about everything's regimented, right? And then the leader is more of that, as we were just touching on earlier, that customer centric mindset. And I think it's fascinating that you guys are getting into that, because one of the key things that I hope the listeners have understood by now, because Brandon and I seem to talk about this a fair amount, is the importance of that self-assessment, that early on, that self-awareness, understanding where you are as a leader, because then you have an opportunity to model the growth mindset to those that are on your team. Because if they see you taking that true self-assessment and then being able to say, okay, this is where I am, I want to get better at these 2 or 3 things, and they see that you're investing the time into, things like the plunge and different other things that you have on your website, that speaks volumes too, because now you're not just talking about it, you're doing it. And now all of a sudden the people that are on your team say, oh, okay, this is something I can get behind because he's demonstrating or she's demonstrating to me that growth is so important.
Yes. Very true. Very true. It's leading by example, John and Brendan. It's they want to see that, I call that embodying. So you're embodying the vision, you're embodying the ideas, so that when you speak, they say, you know what, Brandon is doing it, John is doing it, I want to be a part of that. In addition to enlisting people. So how are you embodying this new culture? How are you embodying great leadership, effective leadership, so that the people that are following behind you can say, this is exactly what I want to become as well, that I want to be. In fact, you want them to see that, so that they take over the vision that you've put, right? You want them to own the vision, that when they speak, when your employees speak about the vision, they actually think it's their own vision. They've come up with it because they're so excited about it. They start to teach you like, no. And they correct you. That's exactly, then you've won, you've really embodied it. Yeah.
Yeah, a friend of mine years ago said his idea of being successful as a manager when we first became managers was you manage yourself out of a job in the sense that you are teaching really, truly people to be vested as you are in whatever the goal is, whatever the task is, but also that they're doing enough self-assessment, self-reflecting, the self-coaching, if you will, that they can do some of those things. I'm curious, you had brought this up early on in the podcast, and it was something I was going to touch on with you as well, is one of the things, not only in your family, but as you mentioned in Zimbabweans in general, is this idea of unity and, that collective spirit. Have you found that kind of foundation for you has helped in not only developing the culture at Almenta International, but also gives you just that extra understanding of how powerful that can be from a cultural standpoint? Because you could argue that your area, whatever, your community, that's your first culture, right? I mean, before you start trying to create that in companies, every group and gathering is a culture. So when you see it done right, like you had an opportunity to observe early on in life, I would imagine that's pretty powerful for not only the way you communicate the importance of culture to companies, but also, just within your own organization.
Yes. There's power in unity. There's power in the collective. Just bringing people together with the same vision, that are obsessed about maybe customers. They're obsessed about their product. They're obsessed about something. There is something that is tangible. So John and Brandon, I'm going to tell you this. My dad our dad passed away on the 20th of January. So every 20th of January, my siblings and I are together. Every 20th, and we're scattered all over the world, but we stop and we make that time because of that unity. In that space, in that space, we bring anything that you want to talk about, whether it's work, whether it's business. Yesterday, I was in the spotlight. I was being helped to navigate stuff. All right. So there's so much power in the collective. There's so much power in the unity, that if it's built, if it's fostered, it can be a powerful tool in an organization. In that space, there's a celebration of the uniqueness. There is healthy competition. We're not competing against each other. We all are uniquely made, and we all are running in our different pillars and in our different pathways. But we understand that, you're trying to get there. How then do we help you to get there? Mm-hmm. So that unity that my dad and my mom fostered in us prevails today. So we've managed to do many projects together, costly projects together, to fund things in Zimbabwe. It's the same thing in our offices, in our workplaces. That if we put our minds together, regardless of our diversity, what is the one thing that we are all obsessed about, that we are crazy about, that we believe that the differences don't really matter, but this one thing overlaps the differences? Can we go at it relentlessly with the belief? You'll be amazed at what you can conquer.
That's fantastic. And I got to tell you, I'm sitting there listening to you and thinking, what a legacy your dad left. I mean, that's just an incredible legacy.
And what a legacy that is now permeating through all your generations. I mean, the conviction you have, Dr. Mary, is so strong. And after hearing that story, I want to run through a wall. You know what I'm like? I hear that and I'm like, oh my God.
Brandon sat up in his seat.
Yeah, I'm like, what in the world?
Go.
Like, let's do this.
Yeah.
But I just think that just an amazing story, and it's amazing. It really is. It's very powerful.
Thank you.
It really is.
Thank you, John.
So I'm going to ask you this question. just to close things up here, and we can't thank you enough for joining us today. Do you think that 9-year-old that came home and taught to the imaginary class could have even, just fathomed, envisioned even half of the impact that you have had on so many people?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. And I speak in humility. You'll see that I kind of like get emotional when I talk about these things. So please forgive me.
No.
I didn't think that 9-year-old would. I didn't think. I thought it was a game.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, it was a game. I didn't think, but the passion was there. I was motivated. I was guided by my dad. Saw the best in me and did it. I'll share something personal that I had today. I was coaching somebody today. What happened in that coaching moment was only God's intervention. Because you're right, the 9-year-old me would have never thought I would help a gentleman to that level and touch him, not on a professional level, but at a human level, at a God level. And that's when you know that God knew what he was doing when he called that 9-year-old and who struggled through school and gave her a PhD. But also realizing, Brandon and John, that it's not the PhD. It's a call, it's a ministry. Because with this person, what they told me today was, I've heard so many voices in my life. But you as my coach, when I hear you, I want to do exactly what you ask me to do. And I want to be better. That's the calling. That's a 9-year-old, because a 9-year-old was encouraging students, these imaginary students, to be the best that they can. And here I am today, 40 years later. I'm in that space of encouraging people, inspiring them to be who whatever God has called them to be, regardless of where they come from. It does not matter. How can I help you? How can we help you to be that so that you can go and impact the world? That's what I was born to do, and I love it.
Absolutely. I mean, you have answered the call, and we just continue to ask God to bless you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, John. Thank you for having me, Brandon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doctor.
Want to provide feedback or stay up to date with the show? Visit our Instagram page at Mental Advantage Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@mentaladvantage.net. To have John Cullen work with you or your team, please write to him at john.cullen@mentaladvantage.net. Thanks for listening to today's episode.